Fairy Forest is a fantasy adventure RPG that was created using RPG Maker 2003, and was intended to be a sequel to a game that was never released to my knowledge. In fact, this game was meant to be a follow-up to several other games, but the project that this game was a part of didn't come to fruition, and now only bits and pieces of the intended end product remain. And I'm not entirely sure how many of those bits and pieces are available for me to take a look at. Still, I need to judge this game based on its own merits rather than on games that might have been. Story-wise, Fairy Forest is about a young teen named Ryan, who manages to stumble into an enchanted forest that is occupied by fairies and goblins. In order to escape the forest, he will need to complete tasks for the fairies and free their kidnapped brethren. At least that is what he can piece together based on dialogue that is referring to events taking place in the present. A few boxes of dialogue are obviously being used to reference previous events, but since the previous game was probably never completed, it makes the conclusion of dialogue that references it rather pointless. Though where the game truly begins to falter is when it comes to combat. The combat in this game often glitches out, resulting in the player taking damage because of the game's failure to properly register hits on the enemies. Thankfully, you can complete the various areas without actually defeating the enemies from what I can tell, but your odds of success seem to go up dramatically if you take them out. On a more positive note, the majority of the game is spent searching the starting area for various items and ingredients you'll need in order to advance to the final two areas of the game, though how much enjoyment you'll get out of this aspect of the game depends on how much you enjoy short and simple fetch quests. On the presentation side of things, the game does extremely well. It's obvious that time and effort were put into designing the various areas in the game, as well as the character models and portraits, and the soundtrack definitely adds to the feeling of being in an enchanted forest. Fairy Forest is ultimately a game that is extremely pretty, but is ultimately crippled by its flawed combat system. As it stands, I can't recommend this game to anyone, since it can become extremely frustrating to fail at beating this game due to no faults of your own.